The shoppers were minding their own business, completely unaware of what was going on beneath their feet. They were hurrying through the bakery aisle, or comparing prices on shampoo last week.
Nivea, volume sensation. Nivea intense repair. Nivea 2-in-1 express. I am smooth and glossy. Am I? I am ultra strong, of course.
Well, a few meters below, archaeologists were unearthing something very strange. A Monoprix store in central Paris, kind of like Manor, I think, was interested in developing the level below ground for storage space recently. Central Paris being a place with a few levels of history, you can't just go digging up your basement on your own. I'm sure it's the same here in Geneva. So the store contacted the city, and in came a team of archaeologists to see what was down there, beneath the fluorescent lights and cash registers and linoleum tiles. I'm not sure what they expected to find. There have to be all kinds of interesting things under the streets of Paris. But when they dug down into the earth, what they found were graves. Hundreds of human bodies lined up neatly, laid in place centuries ago. As the initial shock of that discovery began to wear off, the pieces did start to fall into place. This was the site of a hospital during medieval times, and plagues and famines swept through Paris like they did through much of Europe during those years. These were likely victims of an outbreak of a disease, laid to rest there by the monks who ran the hospital. Interesting news to the archaeologists busy downstairs. But what about the people up above? How would you like to be told, while you were busy picking out laundry detergent in a crowded aisle, that you were shopping over a graveyard? What sort of a disruption would that be? Jesus stages his own kind of disruption in that reading we heard and saw from the Gospel of John already this morning. The way the other Gospels tell it, this story comes at the very end of Jesus' life. In John's telling, it's one of the very first things Jesus does. Either way, the Gospel writers all agree on a couple of things. It happened during Passover, and it made quite a scene. Jesus isn't barging into the temple grounds on just any old day. Passover was and still is, of course, one of the central festivals of the Jewish calendar. So Jerusalem would have been packed, busy and bustling with pilgrims in for the observance. There would have been out-of-towners everywhere, local vendors would have been working extra hours to meet the need, and the temple would have been at the center of all of it. So when Jesus walked into that courtyard and started flipping tables and cracking a whip, plenty of people were there to notice. Nothing about this action is discreet or polite. It was a very public action, undertaken at a charged moment, meant to disturb things, meant to draw some attention. This Jesus doesn't look like the meek and mild, soft-eyed type I remember from Sunday school class when I was a kid. Here he looks a whole lot more like the Old Testament prophets, those bristly, unpleasant figures who never minced words with those in positions of religious or political authority. He looks like the embodiment of Amos, who blatantly told the people that God despised their festivals while they trampled the poor. Or like Jeremiah, who smashed a clay pot in front of the people to be sure they got the message that God was not pleased with their devotion and their practice of justice. Everybody understood who the pot symbolized. Jesus looks like that, wild-eyed and fierce and full of indignation, a bull in the china shop of the temple courtyard at Passover. The thing is, it's a little bit tough to tell just what Jesus is so worked up about. Yes, it does look like his anger is directed at all those vendors selling animals and at the people changing money. "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace," he shouts, driving them all out.
Of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves,
"Take these things out of here. Do not make of my Father's house a marketplace."
And that's all well and good, except that all those people were really necessary for the temple to function the way it did. It was customary for worshipers to offer a sacrifice of an unblemished animal, a dove or sheep or cow, at Passover. And who just has one of those around when you've been traveling for days from your home? And the payment of the temple tax had to be made in the local Judean currency, a coin with no human likeness on it. So you couldn't use one of those coins from a neighboring province that had Caesar's face stamped right on it. Maybe Jesus is concerned that these particular vendors are corrupt, but here in John it actually looks like much more is going on. It looks like he's got a problem with the whole shape of worship in his time, with the buying and selling that were necessary to sustain temple worship, even with the whole business of locating God's presence centrally in that building. And when he starts talking about the temple of his own body, it looks like he's pointing to a whole new understanding of where God's presence is to be found.
"Destroy this temple, and I will build it up in 3 days."
The shoppers in Paris had no idea what was happening beneath their feet until a reporter who was writing about the discovery decided to walk the aisles for a bit and start talking to people, letting them know they were shopping over a medieval graveyard, that the clean, sanitized environment upstairs was perched over a cross-section of human life as messy and complex as life itself. Maybe predictably, most were in too much of a hurry to care. They shrugged at the news, kept perusing the sales, making their way through their lists. I might very well have fit into that category. I'm usually trying to get through the store as quickly as I can. But one man did stop outside in the cold air with his baguette and talked for a few moments, commenting on the mysteries all around in the city. I wonder if anyone felt a shiver of admiration for those who devoted their lives to caring for the sick in that place. Or if a few others walked home a little more slowly, maybe just a bit more aware of standing on holy ground. We don't always know what to do with disruptions to the world we know around us, whether it's in a grocery store or at home or in the temple at Passover. Jesus made his great disruption an action that likely made everybody uncomfortable, that had everybody talking at the time. But what happened afterward? What did people actually do when the dust had settled and the wild prophet had left the scene? I saw a painting of this story by a Renaissance painter this past week that offers one picture of how people might have reacted. A money chaser is chasing after his coins, rolling across the floor. A sheep seller is backing off with a sheep over his shoulder. A boy tries to trap a freed bird flying away. And a mother grabs a child who is staring in rapt attention at this man brazenly swinging a whip. I like that human portrayal of the scene because I have to imagine that for most people, things probably went back to normal pretty quickly. I have to imagine the coins were swept up, the animals were calmed down and tied up again, and the stalls were open for business a couple hours later. I have to imagine that while people were shocked, business basically continued. Because that's the way it is, isn't it? We don't always know what to do with disruptions to the world as we know it. And Jesus kind of specializes in disruptions. Yes, of course, we find words of comfort and assurance from him, those treasured words of easy burdens and a light yoke and abundant life, all of which are true. But just as often, we find Jesus busting into the neat, ordered worlds we create and cracking a whip, overturning tables, turning the place upside down. This is the Jesus who tells us that being a disciple is about losing your life and only thereby finding it. This is the Jesus who tells us that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, but in offering one's life for others. This is the Jesus who tells us that the first will be last and the last will be first. The Jesus who tells us we're to love and to pray not only for our friends, but also for our enemies. This is the Jesus whose cross taught Paul and the church after him that God works through foolishness, not wisdom, through weakness, not strength. This is the Jesus who storms into our lives and our churches and our society and tells us we've got things turned around backwards, who wreaks havoc inside the temples we create and drives us out in God's name. And what do we do with that? What do we do with this Jesus who is so far from tame, who is so often a challenge? I'm not often sure, of course. I know from experience that it's easiest to be like the money changers in that painting, to gather up the coins from the floor and go back to business as usual, to go back to seeing life as competition, to thinking that happiness can be bought, to judging the value of a human life by test scores or salary or prestige, to imagining that God is present only in times of joy and not in the wilderness. It's hard to take Jesus' disruptions to heart. But look around you this morning. This is part of why we're here together as a community. We're here to help one another do just that. And read a few verses farther in John, and you find an example. A person who did not simply return to the life he knew after all that commotion in the temple, who found his life forever disrupted by Jesus. The Pharisee Nicodemus comes to see Jesus at night, that very night, with something burning inside him, with questions, with confusion, maybe with a flicker of hope, with the nagging feeling that something about this one and his strange, foolish ways might really be true. That this disrupted life might actually be life itself. Maybe that's where the story leads us, because this is always the invitation of the Christian life, to let God disrupt us again and again, disrupt us to full and new and abundant life, and to the grace that is there beneath our feet, all around us, here and now. Amen.